welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate, and today I'm finally going to be doing another dedicated review, and this one is for Blackwing by Ed McDonald. I had picked this book up because I had seen the review that Alan over at the Library of Allenxandria had done for it, and it sounded like a book that was right in my wheelhouse. I'm trying to remember exactly what he described it as, but basically sort of Lovecraftian, has kind of a Mad Max / Borderlands feel to it, and some other things that had really appealed to me. And I think I finished watching that review and then immediately went over and ordered the book to have it to me in the next couple of days. And then I picked it up while on vacation and ended up devouring it, and I think I read it in 3 or 4 days. So I definitely wanted to be able to talk about this one because I do think it's one that not that many people have talked about in the past. So the way that I would describe Blackwing is it's one of the few books that I found that made me feel like it fit into a weird Western subgenre, which is a subgenre that I absolutely love. For anyone who doesn't know, a weird Western is a story that has Western elements and also has either, I usually see it with horror elements, but I think you can also include sci-fi elements, so it's just a blending of Western and kind of more paranormal stuff. This definitely gave me those vibes. It's not technically a Western, but there are definitely elements that made me think of that. It's got kind of an industrial vibe where the technology setting is more in the realm of cannons, matchlocks, but they also have factories and stuff like that. So it's kind of in that relative setting. And then I don't think you can really call it grim dark, but it has a very bleak atmosphere to it that made me think of stuff like Black Company. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, you might check this out. I would definitely recommend checking out Alan's review because I think he does a great job of describing the setting for Blackwing and kind of the way the magic works, which I probably won't get into as much detail since I want to talk about some of the other elements. So I definitely recommend checking out his review of it. So Blackwing is set in a fantasy world where humanity is kind of torn between these corrupted, kind of nightmarish creatures known as the Deep Kings, who very much want to invade. They came out of the sea at one point, very Lovecraftian, and they want to take over basically everything. And they're being opposed by a set of sorcerers who are known as the Nameless. And the Nameless have been fighting the Deep Kings for a very long time. So it's kind of this very frontier setting. There's a patch of land known as the Misery that basically stands between the Deep Kings and then the human settlements, which are technically protected by the Nameless. But most of the Nameless have disappeared or died. So the humans are kind of trying to figure out whether or not they can actually defend themselves from the Deep Kings if they choose to invade again. And this patch of land that's between them is completely corrupted and devastated by the last big battle between the Deep Kings and the Nameless. And there's a bunch of really nightmarish creatures that occupy it. The outposts that are along this patch, called the Misery, are supposed to be keeping the Deep Kings from getting any further into human territory. And there's a specific weapon that's supposed to basically keep them away. And the main character in the story is a captain. His name is Ryhalt Galharrow, and he basically leads a band of mercenaries, and he also reports directly to one of the Nameless sorcerers, who will send him out on various important missions. And when he's not going on missions for the sorcerer Crowfoot, he is a bounty hunter. So that's kind of the part that made me really think Western was this kind of frontier outpost, and the bounty hunter side of things definitely gave me those vibes. When the story starts, there's the Crowfoot sends Gal Harrow out to rescue a noblewoman who's at one of the frontier outposts. And he doesn't really give any details. He just says, go rescue this woman. She's going to be important. And then as the story progresses, Gal Harrow and his band start getting entangled in this conspiracy. And there's a lot of more political elements as they kind of get dragged into this right as the Deep Kings are set to maybe invade again. So it's a very bleak, very atmospheric setting with some very Black Company-esque anti-hero characters. For this next section, I'm going to get into how I rated various categories in this book. For anybody who doesn't already know, I use the CAWPILE system developed by Book Roast. So there's 7 different categories that I rate the book on to give me an overall rating. I'll link her video describing it if you're curious. I'm going to keep this next section relatively spoiler-free, but if you don't want any details on the various categories, go ahead and skip to the end. I have a TLDR section where I'll give basic recommendations and overall thoughts if you don't want any details about it. So feel free to either watch or skip as you please. So the first category I'm going to be talking about is characters, and this is going to make this review a little bit of a rant review at the very beginning. Overall, I enjoyed this, but the characters are where I had the biggest struggle with Blackwing and what kept me from rating it higher. I ended up rating the characters at 7 out of 10, and part of this is just not connecting with the main character. And this is the problem that I tend to have with first-person narratives, which is what this book is written in. If I can't connect with the main character and it's written in first person, it's very difficult for me to get over that. And that was definitely the case here. Gal Harrow is a kind of embittered man who used to have a lot more in his life, and basically because of some mistakes in the past, all of that has been taken from him. He is just basically out to do his job. He just wants to go to the bar at the end of the day, and he does have this inner moral core that he wants to do the right thing, but frequently this kind of grim, bleak world has taken that from him, and he's almost he's very anti-hero, almost a bad guy. Again, reminded me a lot of Black Company. Some of the commentary that he has is very dismissive or not great about certain groups of people, so you kind of have to be okay with a character who's not super likable in parts. There were times I wanted to root for him because it felt like he was doing the right thing, even if he was kind of a little selfish about it. And then there were times that it was just like, I just can't get behind this dude. So I think that was the struggle for me. Some of the other characters were really interesting, but it wasn't because the story is told from Gal Harrow's perspective. It was still a little bit difficult to really get invested in some of the characters. And then my only other gripe is that Gal Harrow is fairly melodramatic, and there are parts in this story where he's kind of just brooding and holding this pity party about all the things that life has taken from him. And I get it, but also I had to skim some bits because I just don't have a lot of patience for that. So that's why I struggled with some of these characters. Well, really just the one. For atmosphere, I gave this a 9 out of 10. I think this was spectacular. I don't know very many stories that have made it feel as grim and grimy as McDonald really made this story feel. It definitely has this Lovecraftian element of humans being caught between two forces that don't really care that much about them. They care about the bigger picture and about bigger things than the little people. So it's very bleak in parts. It does have a pretty dark gallows humor feel to it. So it's not humorless, but it's a very dark world that Galhero and everybody else is trying to make their way in. So McDonald really makes you feel that. It also has, it might be partly because there's this conspiracy mystery and it's in first person, but to me it has a very detective noir feel to it as well. So it's very immersive, and I really enjoyed the atmosphere that McDonald creates in this story. The next category is writing, which I gave an 8 out of 10. It has a very coarse, like I said, detective noir feel to it that makes it very interesting, but there are some elements, like I said, there were parts that I skimmed because it felt like too much time was being spent on Galhero brooding. And I feel like if the writing style had pulled, if the writing for those sections had pulled me in more, I might have minded a bit less. But because I had parts that it's like, okay, I can't do any more of this, and I'm just gonna skip through this section. That's why it's not a little bit higher for the writing. I will say one thing that I think McDonald does really, really well is the fight scenes. It's very clear reading it that McDonald has experience in different fighting styles, because he talks, the way he talks about buckler, the way he talks about spear, the way he talks about fighting with shields, it's just extremely clear that he has experience in it, and he's good at describing how the fight is working without getting too slow or technical. So I really enjoyed the fight scenes part of it. I absolutely love that. Moving on to plot, I gave this an 8 out of 10 as well. It's not, this one's in kind of a weird middle territory for me, where it's not super fast paced, but it's also not slow. It kind of, the beginning, oops, sorry about the camera shake. The beginning has this kind of slow build of tension as the world starts getting explored, and as they start kind of trying to unravel this question about whether or not the weapons still work, and whether or not they can defend themselves against the Deep Kings if they invade, and how much the Nameless are actually going to be able to help them. All of these elements are kind of this slow ramp up to the final climax, and by the time you hit the end, it's fast paced, super exciting, extremely difficult to put down. Prior to that, it's a little bit slower as it builds to it. So if you don't like slow paced stuff, you kind of have to have a little bit of patience, but I think it really pays off towards the end. For Intrigue, I gave this an 8 out of 10. Part of this is that I read it really quickly, or fairly quickly for me. It wasn't like a one-sitting book, but it was still very enjoyable. I had, especially like I said, at the end, I was completely hooked, couldn't put it down, because it's so grim and so bleak of a world. There are parts where I kind of wanted a happier book to pair this with, because it's almost depressing dealing with all of the things. The way the world is set up is very you can't ever reveal weakness because people are going to exploit it, and a lot of the characters have really messed up backgrounds, and so it's a very much, like I said, I keep saying grim and bleak, but it really felt that way to me. So there were parts that I really wanted to know what was happening, but I also didn't really want the depressing mood. So you just kind of have to deal with that part, and that's where like the intrigue was there, but also I needed a break sometimes. But it kept me going, so obviously the intrigue was high enough there. For logic, I gave this a 8 out of 10. Sometimes I think the main thing that killed me is there's an interesting dynamic in the relationships between Galhero and the people in his crew, and I really liked that part, and it really did feel like that's how someone, you get some details about Galhero's past, and it makes sense that there's this distance between Galhero and the men, even though they care for each other, there's still distance between them because of their past. And I think that was handled really well. What brought this down a little bit for me is there's a romantic element that happens in part of the book, um, and it didn't feel earned. It felt kind of rushed, and like there were elements where it was there, but it never really felt real to me. I had a hard time buying it in general, so that was the the reactions related to the romance were a little melodramatic and unreal to me. So I didn't like that part of it. So now I'll get into enjoyment. This was an 8 out of 10 for me. I loved the atmosphere. I absolutely loved the world building. It's one of the first times that I think I've seen this sort of Lovecraft idea of these otherworldly beings, A, corrupting people, and B, being something that is so far above humanity that we can't really wrap our brains around it. That was done spectacularly well. The feel was, or the mood was perfect for this type of story, even though, like I've said, it got to be a little more bleak than I usually enjoy. But it was still so well handled. I did really struggle with some of the parts of Galhera, with him getting very brooding, with kind of being difficult to root for sometimes, just because he was so embittered and so unwilling to really trust some of the people around him. And you get why. It's just also hard to root for. So that was a little bit of a struggle for me, but overall, I really think that McDonald got hit what he was aiming for. It had the right feel to it. It was very intriguing. It made me want to pick it up, and it made me want to read the other books in the series. So I definitely enjoyed this, even if there were parts that I didn't enjoy quite as much. Okay, so moving back to the overall TLDR section of this, my overall rating for Blackwing is 7.8, which rounds it to 4 stars. What I loved about it is that it's very rare for me to find a weird Western. It's kind of a very niche subgenre. I tend to really enjoy them when I find them, and I think Blackwing fits very well into that category. It's a very interesting blend of these kind of frontier elements with Lovecraftian elements, and I think it was handled very well. It's super atmospheric, it's bleak and grim, and there are some gruesome parts relating to some of the nightmarish creatures, so it does kind of have some of those horror elements. I said in one of the categories, the fight scenes were wonderful. They were so, well, wonderful is not the right word, because they're not pretty. It's not like Tolkien's glorious battle. It's grim and it's dirty, but it's really well done. So I really liked that part. What might not work for you, there are very few info dumps. It kind of reveals the story as you go, which works really well for people like me that don't like info dumps, but might work less well for people who want all of the answers up front, because you definitely don't have them at the beginning. You kind of learn them as you go. The characters, like I mentioned, are not very likable. They're very Black Company-esque in terms of being anti-heroes and having taking actions and having thoughts that are not what you would want out of lawful good characters, but that's not what they are. They're compelling, but they're not necessarily good people, except deep down. If you can't handle some melodrama and some romance that could have been done a little bit better, this also may not be the story for you. And I think if you get bored by fight scenes, this might be a little bit of a struggle, because especially towards the end, there's less of that in the beginning and in the middle, but the end is very battle heavy. So if you don't enjoy that, this also may be a little bit of a struggle. And there's a fair amount of political intrigue. So just go in knowing those elements, and I think you'll have a good time with it. But if those things don't appeal to you, this may not be the right choice. So overall, would I recommend it? I would highly recommend it to anybody who likes kind of more bleak, somewhat gruesome stories that blend fantasy with a bit of horror, and want something that feels morally gray, but it's not like the Broken Empire level of morally gray. There's still a good moral core to some of the characters. You just have to deal with them being kind of uh, not great to others sometimes. So that's just part of it. I am definitely going to be continuing with this series. I like I said, I don't know that I'll finish this year because I need happy books like Discworld or something to read in between these books, because I am susceptible on a mood level to something that's a little bit more on the grim side of things. Um, so like I said, I will definitely continue, but we'll see how fast. Hopefully this gave you a sense of whether or not you might like Blackwing. If you have read Blackwing, please let me know what you thought of it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.